Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. We are reading We the Living by Anne Rand. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, share. And yeah, we are on chapter 3 of the page of the book We the Living. Two hands held a little book bound in grey burlap. They were dry and calloused. They had seen many years of labor in the oil and the heat and the grease of roaring machines. The wrinkles were encrusted in black on a skin stiff with the dust of years. There were black tips on the cracked fingernails. One finger wore a tarnished ring with an imitation emerald. The office had bare walls. They had served as towel to many dirty hands, for traces left by 5 fingers zigzagged across the faded paint. In the old house now nationalized for government offices, it had been a washroom. The sink was removed, but a rusty online with outline with garling nail holes still drew its picture on the wall, and two broken pipes hung out like the bowels of the wounded building. The window had an iron grate and broken panes which a spider had tried to mend. It faced a bare wall with red bricks, losing the last scraps of paint which had been the advertisement of a hair restorer. The official sat at his desk. The desk had a bottom torn in one corner and a half dry inkstand. The official wore a khaki suit and glasses. Like two silent judges presiding behind their spokesman, two pictures flanked his head. They had no frames, four thumbstacks nailed each to the wall. One was of linen, the other of Karl Marx. Red letters above them said, "In union lies our strength." Head high, Kira Argonova stood before the desk. She was there to receive her labor book. Every citizen over 16 had to have a labor book and was ordered to carry it at all times. It had to be presented and stamped when he found employment or left it, when he moved into an apartment or out of one, when he enrolled at a school, got a beard card or was married, got a bread card or was married. The new Soviet passport was more than a passport. It was a citizen's permit to live. It was called labor book for labor, and life were considered synonymous. The Russian Socialist Federalist Soviet Republic was about to acquire a new citizen. The official held the little book bound in grey burlap, whose many pages he was going to fill. He had trouble with pen. It was old and rusty and dragged strings from the bottom of the inkstand. On the clean open page, he wrote name Argonova Kira Alexandrovna, height medium. Kira's body was slender, too slender, and when she moved with a sharp, swift, geometrical precision, people were conscious of the movement alone, not of the body. Yet, through any garment she wore, the unseen presence of her body made her look undressed. People wondered what made them aware of it. It seemed that the words she said were ruled by the will of her body and that her sharp movements were the unconscious reflection of her dancing, laughing soul, so that her spirit seemed physical and her body spiritual. The office wrote, eyes grey. Kira's eyes were dark grey. The grey of storm clouds from behind the sun can be expected at any moment. They looked at people quietly, directly, with something that people called arrogance, but which was only a deep, confident calm that seemed to tell men her sight was too clear and none of their favorite binoculars were needed to help her look at life. Mouth ordinary. Kira's mouth was thin, long. When silent, it was cold, indomitable, and men thought of Valkyrie with lance and winged helmet in the sweep of battle. But a slight movement made a wrinkle in the corner of her lips, and men thought of an imp perched on top of a toadstool, laughing in the faces of daisies. Hair brown. Kira's hair was short, thrown back of her head. Light rays lost in its tangled mass the hair of a primitive jungle woman over a face that had escaped from the easel of a modern artist who had been in a hurry. a face of straight, sharp lines sketched furiously to suggest an unfinished promise. Particular signs? None. The Soviet official picked a thread off his pen, rolled it in his fingers, and wiped them on his trousers. Place and date of birth? Petrograd, April 11, 1904. Kira was born in the grey granite house on Kamenostrovsky. In that vast mansion, Galina Petrovna had a boudoir where at night a maid in black fastened the clasps of her diamond necklaces, and a reception room where her taffeta petticoats rustling solemnly, she entertained ladies with sables and lorgnettes. Children were not admitted into these rooms, and Galina Petrovna seldom appeared in any of the other. Kira had an English governess, a thoughtful young lady with a lovely smile. She liked her governess but often preferred to be alone and was left alone. When she refused to play with a crippled relative of whom the family's compassion had made a general idol, she was never asked to do it again. When she threw out of the window the first book she read about the good fairy rewarding an unselfish little girl, the governess never brought another one of that kind. When she was taken to church and sneaked out alone in the middle of the services, to get lost in the streets and be brought home to her frantic family in a police wagon, she was never taken to church again. The Argonov summer residence stood on a high hill over a river, alone in its spacious gardens on the outskirts of a fashionable summer resort. The house turned its back upon the river and faced the grounds where the hill sloped down gracefully into a garden of lawns drawn with a ruler, bushes clipped into the archway, and marble fountains made by famous artists. The other side of the hill hung over the river like a mass of rock and earth disgorged by a volcano and frozen in its chaotic tangle. Rowing downstream, people expected a dinosaur to stretch its head out of the black caves overgrown with wild ferns, between trees that grew horizontally into the air, huge roots like spiders grasping the rocks. For many summers, while her parents were visiting Nice, Biarritz, and Vienna, Kira was left alone to spend her days in the wild freedom of the rocky hill, as its sole, undisputed sovereign in a torn blue skirt and a white shirt whose sleeves were always missing. The sharp sand cut her bare feet. She swung back from rock to rock, grasping a tree branch, throwing her body into space, the blue skirt flaring like a parachute. She made a raft of tree branches and, clutching a long pole, sailed down the river. There were many dangerous rocks and whirlpools on the way. The thrill of the struggle rose from her bare feet that felt the stream pulsating under the frail raft through her body, tense to meet the wind, the blue skirt beating against her legs like a sail. Branches bending over the river brushed her forehead. She swept past, leaving threads of hair entwined in the leaves, and the trees leaving wild red berries caught in her hair. The first thing that Kira learned about life and the first thing that her elders learned, dismayed about Kira, was the joy of being alone. Born in 1904, huh? Said the Soviet official. That makes you, let's see, 18. 18. You're lucky, comrade. You're young and have many years to give to the cause of the toilers. A whole life of discipline and hard work and useful labor for the great collective. He had a cold, so he took out a large checkered handkerchief and blew his nose. Family position? Single. I wash my hands of Kira's future, Galina Petrovna had said. Sometimes I think she's a born old maid and sometimes a born, yes, bad woman. Kira saw her first years of lengthened skirts and high heels during their refuge in Yalta, where the strange society of emigrants from the north, families of old names and past fortunes, clung together like frightened chickens on a rock with the flood rising slowly around them. Young men of irreproachably parted their and manicured nails, parted hair and manicured nails, noticed a slim girl who strode down the street, swinging a twig like a whip, her body thrown into the wind that blew a short dress which hid nothing. Galina Petrovna smiled with approval when the young men called at their house, but Kira had strange eyebrows. She could lift them in such a cold, mocking smile, while her lips remained motionless, that the young men's love, poems, and intentions froze at the very roots. And Galina Petrovna soon stopped wondering why the young men stopped noticing her daughter. In the evenings, Lydia read avidly, blushing books of delicate, sinful romance which she hid from Galina Petrovna. Kira began reading one of these books. She fell asleep and it did not finish it. She never began another. Saw no difference between weeds and flowers. She yawned when Lydia sighed at the beauty of a sunset over lonely hills. But she stood for an hour looking at the black silhouette of a tall young soldier against the roaring flame of a blazing oil while he had been posted to guard. She stopped suddenly as they walked down a street in the evening and pointed at a strange angle of white wall over battered roofs, luminous on a black sky in the glare of an old lantern, with a dark barred window like that of dungeon, and she whispered, "How beautiful." "What's beautiful about it?" Lydia asked. "Because it's so strange, promising, as if something good happened there." "Happen to whom?" "To me." Lydia seldom questioned Kira's emotions. They were not feelings to her, but only Kira's feelings. And the family shrugged impatiently at what they called Kira's feelings. She had the same feeling for eating soup without salt and for discovering a snail slithering up her bare leg. And for young men who pleaded broken hearted, their eyes humid, their lips soft, she had the same feeling for white statues of ancient gods against black velvet in museums, and for steel shavings and rusty dust and hissing torches and muscle tenses as electric wires in the iron roar of a building under construction. She seldom visited museums, but when they went out with Kira, her family avoided passing by any construction work. Houses and particularly roads and most particularly bridges, she was certain to stop and stand watching for hours. Red bricks and oaken beams and steel panels growing under the will of man. But she could never be made to enter a public part on Sunday, and she stuck her fingers into her ears when she heard a chorus singing folk songs. When Galina Petrovna took her children to see a sad play depicting the sorrow of the serfs whom Caesar Alexander II had magnanimously freed, Lydia sobbed over the plight of the humble, kindly peasants cringing under a whip, while Kira sat tense, erect, eyes dark in ecstasy, watching the whip crackling expertly in the hand of a tall young overseer. "How beautiful," said Lydia, looking at a stage setting. "It's almost real." "How beautiful," said Kira, looking at a landscape. "It's almost artificial." "In a way," said the Soviet official, "you comrade women have an advantage over us men. You can take care of the young generation, the future of our republic. There are so many dirty, hungry children that need the loving hands of our women. Union membership? None." Kira went to school in Yalta. The school dining room had many tables. At luncheon, girls sat at these tables in couples, in fours, in dozens. Kira always sat at a table in a corner, alone. One day, her class declared a boycott against the little freckled girl who had incurred the displeasure of her most popular classmate, a loud voiced young lady who had a smile, a handshake, and a command ready for everyone. That noon at luncheon, the little table in the corner of the dining room was occupied by two students, Kira and the freckled girl. They were half through their bowls of buckwheat mush when the indignant class leader approached them. "Do you know what you are doing, Argonova?" she asked, eyes blazing. "Eating mush," answered Kira. "Won't you sit down?" "Do you know what this girl here has done?" "I haven't the slightest idea." "You haven't? Then why are you doing this for her?" "You're mistaken. I'm not doing this for her. I'm doing it against 28 other girls." "So you think it's smart to go against the majority?" "I think that when in doubt about the truth of an issue, it's safer and in better taste to select the least numerous of the adversaries. May I have the salt, please?" At the age of 13, Lydia fell in love with a grand opera tenor. She kept his picture on her dresser with a single red rose in a thin crystal glass beside it. At the age of 15, she fell in love with Saint Francis of Assisi, who talked to the birds and helped the poor, and she dreamed of entering a convent. Kira had never been in love. The only hero she had known was a Viking whose story she had read as a child, a Viking whose eyes never looked farther than the point of his sword. But there was no boundary for the point of his sword, a Viking who walked through life, breaking barriers and reaping victories, who walked through ruins while the sun made a crown over his head. But he walked light and straight without noticing its weight. A Viking who laughed at kings, who laughed at priests, who looked at heaven only when he bent for a drink over a mountain brook, and there, overshadowing the sky, he saw his own picture. A Viking who lived but for the joy and the wonder and the glory of the god that was himself. Kira did not remember the books she had read before that legend. She did not want to remember the ones she had read after it. But through the years that followed, she remembered the end of the legend when the Viking stood on a tower over a city she had conquered. The Viking smiled as men smile when they look up at heaven, but he was looking down. His right arm was one straight line with his lowered sword. His left arm, straight as the sword, raised a goblet of wine to the sky. The first rays of a coming sun, still unseen to the earth, struck the crystal goblet. It sparkled like a white torch. Its rays lighted the faces of those below, to a life, said the Viking, which is a reason unto itself. So you are not a Union member citizen, said the Soviet official. Too bad, too bad. The trade unions are the steel girder of our great state building, as said. Well, one of our great leaders said, what's a citizen? Only a brick and of no use unless cemented to other bricks just like it. Occupation student. From somewhere in the aristocratic Middle Ages, Kira had inherited the conviction that labor and effort were ignoble. She had gone through school with the highest grade and the sloppiest composition books. She burned her piano etudes and never darned her stockings. She climbed to the pedestal of statues in the park to kiss the cold lips of Greek gods, but slept at symphony concerts. She sneaked out through a window when guests were expected, and she could not cook a potato. She never went to church and seldom read a newspaper, but she had chosen a future of the hardest work and most demanding effort. She was to be an engineer. She had decided it with her first thought about the vague thing of called future, and the first thought that had been quiet and reverent, for her future was consecrated because it was her future. She had played with mechanical toys which were not intended for girls and had built ships and bridges and towers. She had watched rising steel and bricks and steam. Over Lydia's bed hung an icon. Over Kira's, the picture of an American skyscraper. Even though those who listened smiled incredulously, she spoke about the houses she would build of glass and steel, about a white aluminum bridge across a blue river. But Kira, you can't make a bridge of aluminium. About men and wheels and cranes under her orders, about a sunrise on the steel skeleton of a skyscraper. She knew she had a life and that it was her life. She knew the work which she had chosen and which she expected of life. The other thing which she expected, she did not know, for it had no name. But it had been promised to her, promised in a memory of her childhood. When the summer sun sank behind the hills, Kira sat on a high cliff and watched the fashionable casino far down by the river. The tall spire of the music pavilion pierced the red sky. The slim black shadows of women moved against the orange panel of the lighted glass doors. An orchestra played in the pavilion. It played gay, sparkling tunes from musical comedies. It threw the fire of electric signs, of ringing glasses, of shining limousines, of nights in Europe's capitals, into the dark evening sky over a silent river and a rocky hill with prehistorical trees. The light tunes of casinos and beer gardens, sung all over Europe by girls with sparkling eyes and swaying hips, had a significance for Kira that no one else ever attached to them. She heard in them a profound joy of life, so profound that it could be as light as a dancer's feet. And because she worshipped joy, Kira seldom laughed and did not go to see comedies in theatres. And because she felt a profound rebellion against the weighty, the tragic, the solemn, Kira had a solemn reverence for those songs of defiant gaiety. They came from the strange world where grown ups moved among colored lights and white tables, where there was so much that she could not understand and so much that was awaiting her. They came out of her future. She had selected one song as her, Kira's own. It was from an old operetta and was called the Song of Broken Glass. It had been introduced by a famous beauty of Vienna. There had been a balustrade on the stage overlooking a drop with the twinkling lights of a big city and a row of crystal goblets lined along the balustrade. The beauty sang the number and one by one, lightly, hardly touching them, kicked the crystal goblets and sent them flying in tingling, glittering splinters around the tight sheer stockings on the most beautiful legs in Europe. There were sharp little blows in the music and waves of quick, fine notes that burst and rolled like the thin, clear ringing of broken glass. There were slow notes as if the chords of the violin trembled in hesitation, tense with the fullness of sound, taking a few measured steps before the leap into the explosion of laughter. The wind blew Kira's hair across her eyes and sent a cold breath at the toes of her bare feet hanging over the cliff's edge. In the twilight, the sky seemed to rise slowly to a greater height, growing darker, and the first star dropped into the river. A lonely little girl on a slippery rock listened to her own hymn, and smiled at what it promised her. Such had been Kira's entrance into life, cemented it with under great temple vaults, with head bowed in awe with the light of sacrificial candles in their hearts and eyes, cemented it with a heart like a pavement, tramped by many feet, and with a cold skin crying for the warmth of the heart. Kira Agnovna entered it with the sword of a Viking, pointing the way, and an operetta tune for a battle march. The Soviet official angrily wiped his pen with his checkered handkerchief, for he had made an ink spot on the last page. Toil, comrade, he said, is the highest aim of our lives. Who does not toil shall not eat. The book was filled. The official applied his rubber stamp on the last page. The stamp bore a globe overshadowed by a cross, sickle, and hammer. Here's your labor book, Citizen Argonova, said the Soviet official. You are now a member of the greatest republic ever established in the history of the world. May the brotherhood of workers and peasants ever be the goal of your life, as it is the goal of all red citizens. He handed her the book. Across the top of the first page was printed the slogan, Proletarians of the World, Unite. Under it was written the name Kira Argonovna. Argonova. That brings us to chapter 3 end. Chapter 4. Kira had blisters on her hands where the sharp string had rubbed too long. It was not easy to carry packages up 4 floors, 8 flights of stone stairs that smelt of cats and felt cold through the thin soles of her shoes. Every time she hurried down for another load, skipping briskly over the steps, sliding down the banister, she met Lydia, climbing up slowly, heavily clutching bundles to her breast, panting and sighing, bitterly steam blowing from her mouth with every word. Our Lord in heaven, Saint Mother of God. The Argonovs had found an apartment. They had been congratulated as if it were a miracle. The miracle had been made possible by a handshake between Alexander Dmitrievich and the Upravdom, the manager of that house, a handshake after which Alexander Dmitrievich's hand remained empty, but the Upravdoms did not. 3 rooms and a kitchen were worth a little gratitude in an overcrowded city. A bath? The indignant Upravdom had repeated Galina Petrovna's timid question. Don't be foolish, citizen, don't be foolish. They needed furniture bravely. Galina Petrovna paid a visit to the grey granite mansion of Kamenostrovsky. Before the stately edifice rising to the sky, she stood for a few moments, gathering her faded coat with the shedding fur collar tightly around her thin body. Then she opened her bag and powdered her nose. She felt ashamed before the grey slabs of granite. Then she did not close her bag, but took out a handkerchief. Tears were painful in the cold wind. Then she rang the bell. Well, well, so you are citizen Argonova? Said the fat, glossy cheeked sign painter who let her in and listened patiently to her explanation. Sure, you can have your old junk back. That which I don't use. It's in the coach house. Take it. We are not so hard hearted. We know it's tough for all your citizen burgoys. Galina Petrovna threw a wistful glance at her old Venetian mirror whose onyx stand bore a bucket of paint, but she did not argue and went down to the coach house in the backyard. She found a few chairs with missing legs, a few priceless pieces of antique porcelain, a washstand, a rusty samovar, two beds, a chest of old clothes, and Lydia's grand piano, all buried under a pile of books from their library, old boxes, wood shavings, and rat tongues. They hired a drayman to transfer these possessions to the little flat on the fourth floor of an old brick house, whose turbid windows faced the turbid Moika stream. But they could not afford a drayman twice. They borrowed a wheelbarrow, and Alexander Dmitrievich, silently indifferent, carted the bundles left at the Donaevs to their new home. The four of them carried the bundles up the stairs past landings that alternated grimy doors and broken windows. The black stairway is used to be called the back entrance for servants. Their new home had no front entrance. It had no electrical connection. The plumbing was out of order. They had to carry water in pails from the floor below. Yellow stains spread over the ceilings, bearing witness to past rains. It will be very cozy. With just a little work and artistic judgment, Galina Petrovna had said. Alexander Dmitrievich had sighed. The grand piano stood in the dining room. On top of the grand piano, Galina Petrovna put a teapot without handle or nose, the only thing left of her priceless Saks tea service. Shelves of unpainted boards carried an odd assortment of cracked dishes. Lydia's artistry decorated the shelves with borders of paper lace. A folded newspaper supported the shortest leg of the table. A wick floating in a saucer of linseed oil threw a spot of light on the ceiling in the long, dark evenings. In the morning, strands of soot, like cobwebs, swayed slowly in the draught high under the ceiling. Galina Petrovna was the first one to get up in the morning. She threw an old shawl over her shoulders and, blowing hard to make the damp logs burn, cooked millet for breakfast. After breakfast, the family parted. Alexander Dmitrievich shuffled 2 miles to his business, the textile store he had opened. He never took a tramway. Long lines waited for every tramway, and he had no hope of fighting his way aboard. The store had been a bakery shop. He could not afford new signs. He had stretched a piece of cotton with crooked letters by the door over one of the old black glass plates bearing a gold pretzel. He had hung two kerchiefs and an apron in the window. He had scraped the bakery label off the old boxes and stacked them neatly on empty shelves. Then he sat all day, his freezing feet on a cast iron stove, his arms folded on his stomach, drowsing. When a customer came in, he shuffled behind the counter and smiled affectionately. The best kerchiefs in town, citizen. Certainly fast colors, as fast as foreign goods. Would I take lard instead of money? Certainly, citizen pets peasant, certainly. For half a pound, you can have two kerchief, citizen, and a yard of calico for good measure. Smiling happily, he put the lard into the large drawer that served as cash register next to a pound of rye flour. Lydia wound an old knitted scarf around her throat. After breakfast, put a basket over her arm, sighed bitterly, and went to the cooperative. She stood in line, watching the hand of the clock on a distant tower moving slowly around its face, and she spent the time reciting mentally French poems she had learned as a child. But I don't need soap, citizen, she protested when her turn came. At the unpainted counter inside the store that smelled of dill pickles and people's breath, and I don't need dried herring. All we have got today, citizen. Next. All right, I'll take it, Lydia said hastily. We have got to have something. Galina Petrovna washed the dishes after breakfast. Then she put on her glasses and sought out 2 pounds of lentils from the gravel that came with them. She chopped onions, tears rolling down her wrinkles. She washed Alexander Dmitrievitch's shirt in a tub of cold water. She chopped acorns for coffee. If she had to go out, she sneaked hurriedly down the stairs, hoping not to meet the Opravdom. If she met him, she smiled too brightly and sang out, "Good morning, Comrade Opravdom." Comrade Opravdom never answered. She could read the silent accusations in his sullen eyes. Burgoy's private traders. Kira had been admitted to the Technological Institute. She went there every morning, walking, whistling, her hands in the pockets of an old black coat with a high collar buttoned severely under her chin. At the institute, she listened to lectures but spoke to few people. She noticed many red kerchiefs in the crowds of students and heard a great deal about red builders, proletarian culture, and young engineers in the vanguard of the world revolution. But she did not listen, for she was thinking about her latest mathematical problem. During the lectures, she smiled suddenly once in a while at no one in particular, smiled at a dim, wordless thought of her own. She felt as if her ended childhood had been a cold shower, gay, hard, and invigorating. And now she was entering her morning, with her work before her, with so much to be done. At night, the Argonovs gathered round the wick on the dining room table. Galina Petrovna served lentils and millet. There was not much variety in their menus. The millet went fast, so did their savings. After dinner, Kira brought her books into the dining room, for they had but one oil wick. She sat, the book between her elbows on the table, her fingers buried in the hair over her temples, her eyes. She sat, the book between her elbows on the table, her fingers buried in the hair over her temples, her eyes wide, engrossed in circles, cubes, triangles, as in a thrilling romance. Lydia sat embroidering a handkerchief and sighed bitterly. Oh, that Soviet light! Such a light! And to think that someone has invented electricity. That's right, Kira agreed, astonished. It's not a very good light, is it? Funny, I never noticed it before. One night, Galina Petrovna found the millet too mildewed to quick. Found the millet too mildewed to cook. They had no dinner. Lydia sighed over her embroidery, these Soviet menus. That's right, said Kira. We didn't have any dinner tonight, didn't we? Where's your mind? Lydia raged. If any. Do you ever notice anything? Through the evenings, Galina Petrovna grumbled at intervals. A woman engineer, such a profession for a daughter of mine. Is that a way for a young girl to live? Not a boy, not a single pew to visit her. Though tough as a shoe sole, no romance, no delicacy, no finer feelings. A daughter of mine. In the little room which Kira and Lydia shared at night, there was only one bed. Kira slept on a mattress on the floor. They retired early to save light. Tucked under a thin blanket with her coat thrown over it, Kira watched Lydia's figure in a long nightgown, a white stain in the darkness, kneeling before her icons in the corner. Lydia mumbled prayers feverishly, trembling in the cold, making the sign of the cross with a hurried hand, bowing low to the little red light and the few glimmers of stern bronze faces. From her corner on the floor, Kira could see the reddish grey sky in the window and the gold spire of the Admiralty far away in the cold, foggy dusk over Petrograd, the city where so much was possible. Victor Dunaev had taken a sudden interest in the family of his cousins. He came often. He bent over Galina Petrovna's hand as if he were at a court reception and laughed cheerfully as if he were at the circus. In his honor, Galina Petrovna served her last precious bits of sugar instead of saccharine with the evening tea. He brought along his resplendent smile and the latest political gossip and the current anecdotes and the news of the latest foreign inventions and quotations from the latest poems and his opinions on the theory of reflexes and the theory of relativity and the social mission of proletarian literature. A man of culture, he explained, has to be above all a man attuned to his century. He smiled at Alexander Dmitrievich and hastily offered a light for his homemade cigarettes. He smiled at Galina Petrovna and rose hastily every time she rose. He smiled at Lydia and listened earnestly to her discourses on the simple faith, but he always managed to sit next to Kira. On the evening of October 10th, Victor came late. It was 9 o'clock when the sound of the doorbell made Lydia dash eagerly to the little anteroom. Sorry, so terribly, terribly sorry. Victor apologized, smiling, hurling his cold overcoat on a chair, raising Lydia's hand to his lips, and patting his unruly hair with a quick glance in the mirror, all within the space of 1 second. Detained at the Institute Students' Council. I know this is an indecent hour to visit, but I promised Kira a ride around the city, and it's perfectly all right, Victor, dear. Galina Petrovna called from the dining room. Come in and have some tea. The tiny flame floated in linseed oil, quivered with every breath as they sat at the table. 5 huge shadows rose to the ceiling. The feeble glow drew a triangle of light under the 5 pairs of nostrils. Tea gleamed green through heavy glasses cut out of old bottles. I heard, Victor, Galina Petrovna whispered confidentially, like a conspirator. I heard on good authority that this NEP of theirs is only the beginning of many changes, the beginning of the end. Next, they are going to return houses and buildings to former owners. Think of it. You know our house on Kamenstrovsky? If only the clerk in the cooperative is the one who told me about it, and he has a cousin in the party, he ought to know. It is highly probable, Victor stated with authority, and Galina Petrovna smiled happily. Alexander Dmitrievich poured himself another glass of tea. He looked at the sugar, hesitated, looked at Galina Petrovna, and drank his tea without sugar. He said sullenly, times aren't any better. They have called their secret police GPU instead of Sheka. But it's still the same thing. Do you know what I heard at the store today? They have just discovered another anti Soviet conspiracy. They have arrested dozens of people. Today they arrested old Admiral Kovalensky, the one who the one who was blinded in the war, and they shot him without trial. Nothing but rumor, said Victor. People like to exaggerate. Well, anyway, it's becoming easier to get food, said Galina Petrovna. We got the nicest lentils today. And, said Lydia, I got 2 pounds of millet. And, said Alexander Dmitrievich, I got a pound of lard. When Kira and Victor rose to go, Galina Petrovna accompanied them to the door. You will take care of my child, won't you, Victor dear? Don't stay out late. Streets are so unsafe these days. Do be careful and above all, don't speak to any strangers. There are such odd types around nowadays. The cab rattled through silent streets. Wide, smooth, empty sidewalks looked like long canals of grey ice, luminous under the tall lamp posts that swam, jerking past the cab. At times they saw the black circle of a shadow on the bare sidewalk. Over the circle, a woman in a very short skirt stood swaying a little on fat legs in tightly laced shoes. Something like the black silhouette of a windmill wavered down the sidewalk. Over it, a sailor tottered unsteadily, waving his arms, spitting sunflower seeds. A heavy truck thundered by the cab, bristling with bayonets. Among the bayonets, Kira saw the flash of a white face, pierced by 2 holes of dark, frightening eyes. Victor was seeing a modern man of culture must persevere, preserve an objective viewpoint which, no matter what his personal conviction, enables him to see our time as a tremendous historical drama, a moment of gigantic importance to humanity. Nonsense, said Kira. It is an old and ugly fact that the masses exist and make their existence felt. This is a time when they make it felt with particular ugliness, that's all. This is a rash this is a rash unscientific viewpoint, Kira, said Victor, and went on talking about the aesthetic value of sculpture, about the modern ballet, and about new poets whose work were published in pretty little books with glossy white paper covers. He always kept the latest poems on his desk along with the latest sociological treatise. For balance, he explained, and he recited his favorite points in the fashionable manners of an expressionless nasal sing-song, slowly taking Kira's hand. Kira withdrew her hand and looked at the street lights. The cab turned into the quay. She knew they were driving along a river, for on one side of them the black sky had fallen below the ground into a cold, damp void, and long bands of silver shimmered lazily across that void, streaming from lonely lights that hung in the darkness somewhere very far away. On the other side of them, mansions fused into a black skyline of urns, statues, balustrades. There were no lights in the mansions. The horses' hoofs pounding the cobblestones rolled in echoes through rows of empty chambers. Victor dismissed the cab at the summer garden. They walked shuffling through a carpet of dry leaves that no one swept. No lights, no other visitors disturbed the silent desolation of the famous park. Around them, the black walls of an ancient oaks had suddenly swallowed the city, and in the moist, rustling darkness, fragrant of moss, moldy leaves, and autumn, white shadows of statues outlined the wide, straight walks. Victor took out his handkerchief and wiped an old bench wet with dew. They sat down under the statue of a Greek goddess whose nose was broken off. A leaf floated down slowly, fluttered around its head, and settled in the curve of its handless arm. Victor's arm slowly encircled Kira's shoulder. She moved away. Victor bent close to her and whispered, sighing, that he had waited to see her alone, that he had known romance, yes, many romances. Women had been too kind to him, but he had always been unhappy and lonely, searching for his ideal, that he could understand her, that her sensitive soul was bound by conventions, unawakened to life and love. Kira moved farther away and tried to change the subject. He sighed and asked, Kira, haven't you ever given a thought to love? No, I haven't, and I never will, and I don't like the word. Now that you know it, we are going home. She rose, he seized her wrist. No, we are not. Not yet. She jerked her head, and the violent kiss intended for her lips brushed her cheek. A swift movement of her body set her free and sent him reeling against the bench. She drew a deep breath and tightened the collar of her coat. Good night, Victor, she said quietly. I'm going home. Alone. He rose confused, muttering, Kira, I'm sorry. I'll take you home. I said I'm going alone. Oh, but you can't do that. You know you can't. It's much too dangerous. A girl can't be alone in the street at this hour. I'm not afraid. She started walking, he followed. They were out of the summer garden on the deserted quay. A militia man leaned against the parapet, gravely studying the lights in the water. If you don't leave me right now, said Kira, I'm going to tell this militia man that you are a stranger who is annoying me. I will tell him you are lying. You may prove it tomorrow morning. In the meantime, we will both spend a night in jail. Well, go ahead. Tell him. Kira approached the militiaman. Excuse me, comrade. She began. She saw Victor turning and hurrying away. Can you tell me, please, which way is the Moika? Kira walked alone into the dark streets of Petrograd. The street seemed to wind through an abandoned stage setting. There were no lights in the windows over the roof. A church tower rose against floating clouds. The tower looked as if it were swimming slowly across a motionless sky, menacing, ready to collapse into the street below. Lanterns smoked over locked gates. Through grilled peepholes, night watchmen's eyes followed the lonely girl. Militiamen glanced at her sidewise, sleepily suspicious. A cab driver awakened at the sound of her step to offer his services. A sailor tried to follow her but took one look at the expression of her face and changed his mind. A cat dived soundlessly into a broken basement window as she approached. It was long past midnight when she turned suddenly into a street that seemed alive in the heart of a dead city. She saw yellow curtained squares of lights breaking stern bare walls, squares of light on the bare sidewalk at glass entrance doors, dark roofs far away that seemed to meet in the black sky over that narrow crack of stone and light. Kira stopped. A gramophone was playing. The sound burst into the silence from a blazing window. It was the song of broken glass. It was the song of a nameless hope that frightened her, for it promised so much, and she could not tell what it promised. She could not even say that it was a promise. It was an emotion, almost of pain, that went through her whole body. Quick, fine notes exploded as if the trembling chords could not hold them, as if a pair of defiant legs were kicking crystal goblets. And in the gaps of ragged clouds above, the dark sky was sprinkled with a luminous powder that looked like splinters of broken glass. The music ended in someone's loud laughter. A naked arm pulled a curtain over the window. The Kira noticed, then Kira noticed that she was not alone. She saw a woman with lips painted scarlet on faces powdered snow white, with red kerchiefs and short skirts and legs squeezed by high shoes laced too tightly. She saw a man taking a woman's arm and disappearing through a glass door. She understood where she was. With a jerk, she started away hurriedly, nervously towards the nearest corner. And then she stopped. He was tall. His collar was raised. A cap was pulled over his eyes. His mouth calm, severe, contemptuous, was that of an ancient chieftain who could order men to die, and his eyes were such as could watch it. Kira leaned against a lamp post, looking straight at his face, and smiled. She did not think. She smiled, stunned, without realizing that she was hoping he would know her as she knew him. He stopped and looked at her. "Good evening," he said. And Kira, who believed in miracles, said, "Good evening." He stepped closer and looked at her with narrow eyes, smiling, but the corners of his mouth did not go up when he smiled. They went down, raising his upper lips into a scornful arc. "Lonely?" he asked. "Terribly, and for such a long time," she answered simply. "Well, come on." "Yes." He took her arm and she followed him. He said, "We have to hurry. I want to get out of this crowded street." "So do I." "I must warn you not to ask any questions." "I have no questions to ask." She looked at the unbelievable lines of his face. She touched timidly, incredulously, the long fingers of the hand that held her arms. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked. But she did not answer. He said, "I'm afraid I'm not a very cheerful companion tonight. Can I help you?" "Well, that's what you are here for." He stopped suddenly. "What's the price?" he asked. "I haven't much." Kira looked at him and understood why he had approached her. She stood looking silently into his eyes. When she spoke, her voice had lost its tremulous reverence. It was calm and firm. She said, "It won't be much. Where do we go?" "I passed a little garden around the corner. Let's go there first, for a while." "Any militia man around?" "No." They sat on the steps of an abandoned residence. Trees shielded them from a street light, and their faces in the wall behind them were dotted, checkered, sliced with shivering splinters of light. Over their heads were rows of empty windows on bare granite. The mansion bore an unhealed scar above its entrance door from where the owner's coat of arms had been torn. The garden fence had been broken through, and its tall iron spikes bent towards the ground like lances lowered in a grave salute. "Take your cap off," said Kira. "What for?" "I want to look at you." "Sent to search for someone?" "No, sent by whom?" He did not answer and took off his cap. Her face was a mirror for the beauty of his. Her face reflected no admiration but an incredulous, reverent awe. All she was said was, "Do you always go around with your coat shoulder torn?" "That's all I have left." "Do you always stare at people as if your eyes would burst?" "Sometimes." "I wouldn't if I were you. The less you see of them, the better off you are. Unless you have strong nerves and a strong stomach." "I have." "And strong legs." His two fingers were held straight while his fingers drew her skirt up high above her knees, lightly, contemptuously. Her hands grasped the stone steps. She did not pull her skirt down. She forced herself to sit without movement, without breath, frozen to the steps. He looked at her, his eyes moved up and down, but the corners of his lips moved only downward. She whispered obediently without looking at him, and strong legs. Well, if you have strong legs, then run. From you. No, from all people. But forget it. Pull your skirt down. Aren't you cold? No, but she pulled the skirt down. Don't pay attention to what I say, he told her. Have you anything to drink at your place? Oh, yes. I warn you, I'm going to drink like a sponge tonight. Why tonight? That's my habit. It isn't. How do you know? I know it isn't. What else do you know about me? I know that you're very tired. I am. I worked all night. Why? I thought I told you not to ask any questions. He looked at the girl who sat pressed tightly against the wall. He saw only one grey eye, quiet and steady, and above it, one lock of hair. The white wrist of a hand held in a black pocket. The black, ribbed stockings on legs pressed tightly together. In the darkness, he guessed the patch of a long, narrow mouth, the dark huddle of a slender body trembling. A little, his fingers closed around the black stocking. She did not move. He leaned closer to the dark mouth and whispered, Stop staring at me as if I were something unusual. I want to drink. I want a woman like you. I want to go down as far down as you can drag me. She said, You know, you're very much afraid that you can't be dragged down. His hand left her stocking. He looked at her a little closer and asked suddenly, How long have you been in this business? Oh, not very long. I thought so. I'm sorry. I've tried my best. Tried what? Tried to act experienced? You little fool, why should you? I would rather have you as you are, with these strange eyes that see too much. What led you into this? A man? Was he worth that? Yes. What an appetite! For what? For life? If one loses that appetite, why still sit at the table? He laughed. His laughter rolled into the empty windows above them, as cold and empty as the windows. Perhaps to collect under the table a few little crumbs of refuse, like you, that can still be amusing. Take your hat off. She took off her tam. Against the grey stone, her tangled hair and the light tangled in the leaves glittered like warm silk. He ran his fingers through her hair and jerked her head back so violently that it hurt her. Did you love that man? He asked. What man? The one who led you into this. Did I? She was suddenly confused, surprised by an unexpected thought. No, I didn't love him. That's good. Have you ever? She began a question and found that she could not finish it. They say I have no feeling for anyone but myself, he answered, and not much of that. Who said it? A person that didn't like me? I know many people that don't like me. That's good. But I've never known one who said it was good. Yes, you have known one. And can you tell me who that is? Yourself. He bent towards her again, his eyes searching the darkness, then moved away and shrugged. You are wrong. I'm nothing like what I think you think I am. I've always wanted to be a Soviet clerk who sells soap and smiles at the customers. She said, You're so very unhappy. His face was so close she could feel his breath on her lips. Who asked you for sympathy? I suppose you think you can make me like you. Well, don't fool yourself. I don't give a damn what I think of you and less what you think of me. I'm just like any other man you have had in your bed, and like any you will have. She said, You mean you would like to be like any other men? And you would like to think that there haven't been any other men in my bed? He looked at her silently. He looked abruptly. Are you a street woman? She answered calmly. No. He jumped to his feet. Who are you then? Sit down. Answer. I'm a respectable little girl who studies at the Technological Institute, whose parents would throw her out of the house if they knew she had taken talked to a strange man on the street. He looked down at her. She sat on the steps at his feet, looking up at his face. He saw no fear and no appeal in her eyes, only an insolent calm. He asked, "Why did you do it?" "I wanted to know you." "Why?" "I liked your face." "You little fool! If I were someone else, I might have acted differently. But I knew you were not someone else. Don't you know that such things are not being done?" "I don't care." He smiled suddenly. He asked, "Want a confession from me?" "Yes." "This is the first time I've ever tried to buy a woman." "Why did you try it tonight?" "I didn't care. I walked for hours. There isn't a house in this city that I can enter tonight." "Why?" "Don't ask questions. I couldn't make myself approach one of those women. But you, I liked your strange smile. What were you doing on such a street at such an hour?" "I quarreled with someone and I had no car fare and I went home alone and lost my way." "Well, thank you for the most unusual evening. This will be a rare memory to take with me of my last night in the city." "Your last night?" "I'm going away at dawn." "When are you coming back?" "Never, I hope." She got up slowly. She stood facing him. She asked, "Who are you?" "Even if I trust you, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you go away forever. I can't let you go away forever." "Well, I would like to see you again. I'm not going far. I may be back in town. I'll give you my address." "Don't. You're not living alone. I can't enter anyone's house." "Can I come to yours?" "I haven't any." "But then, let's say that we will meet here again in a month. Then, if I am still alive, if I can still enter the city, I will be waiting here for you." "I will come." "November 10th. But let's make it in daylight, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on these steps." "Yes." "Well, it's as crazy as our whole acquaintance. And now it's time for you to go home. You shouldn't be out at this hour." "But where will you go?" "I will walk until dawn. It's only a few more hours. Come on." She did not argue. He took her arm. She followed. They stepped over the bowed lances of the broken fence. The street was deserted. A cab driver on a distant corner raised his head at the sound of their steps. He signaled the cab. Four horseshoes struck forward, shattering the silence. "What's your name?" she asked. "Leo." "And yours?" "Kira." The cab approached. He handed the driver a bill. "Tell him where you want to go," he said. "Goodbye," said Kira, "for a month." "If I'm still alive," he answered, "and if I don't forget." She climbed to the seat, kneeling and facing the back of the carriage. As it slowly started away, her hatless hair in the wind, she watched the man who stood looking after her. When the cab turned a corner, she remained kneeling, but her head dropped. Her hand lay on the seat, helpless, palm up, and she could feel the blood beating in her fingers. Interesting. That brings us to the end of chapter 4. We will be continuing with the reading of chapter 5 in the later readings, which will be tomorrow. Bye bye for now. If you liked, like, share, and subscribe. If you have any kind of doubt, any criticism, any kind of feedback, of course, positive or negative, you are welcome to write in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of YouTube channel. You can follow if you are like following me on Twitch, you can check out my YouTube channel. Similarly, if you are following me on YouTube, you can check out my Twitch channels for the live streams. uh Bye bye. Keep reading. Take care. Bye.